Friends, welcome to this very important topic. All of us who gathered here. I'm expecting that there will be still more people who are coming who will join this um, from different parts of the world. This was an initiative that was first thought of the Palestine Solidarity Network here in India. And then when we started out, we decided that couldn't be working all by ourselves. And so we invited other organizations to join us. And these organizations include the Global Kairos for Asia Pacific, uh, Ecclesia, the Indian, what's that? Okay, the Global Kairos Asia Pacific Solidarity Network, the Palestine Israel Ecumenical Network in Australia, the International Movement for a Just World in Malaysia, the Ecumenical Bishops Fellowship in the Philippines, the Center for Biblical Research and Pastoral Accompaniment in India, it's called Ecclesia, the Indian Christian Women's Movement, ICWM, and the Indo-Palestine Solidarity Network. We are 6 organizations that have come together to organize this. We have, and I'm not completely surprised, but we do have a very people listening in from Europe, even from Latin America. I think, Sarah, there are some people who probably are there on Facebook and so forth, because you are a speaker and you probably have attracted your own people from the region who come there, and that's nice. See Africa here, but I know that they were mobilizing, so we're going to have Africa. We have Australia here, and that's nice because it's a very late time for them, and we really didn't learn how to, so that we could make it easier for them to join. But they are here with us, and that's important for us. The Palestine Israel Ecumenical Network is one of the strongest in the region, and has a very wide reach, not only with church, also working with other organizations in Australia. Christian Zionism, I do not have to explain why we decided this as an issue that we are going to work on. This is not a one-off seminar. It is not a one-off event. It is an event that we hope to continue to work on because we know of the deadly theological and political consequences of Christian Zionism as it happens around the world. Even in planning this, we decided in the follow-up, we will look at Christian Zionism affects Christian-Muslim relations in Asia later, how it affects the Buddhists, the Hindus. So, but today, the focus is on understanding Christian Zionism as a theological and political question. And we have 2 speakers who will specialize who have specialized, who have studied Christian Zionism in a thorough sort of way. The speakers will be introduced to you by Aruna, and I will pass this on to Aruna at this point of time to let her introduce you. But I think in the process of introducing you, she will also make her comment on Christian Zionism. I remember not too long ago, 6 or 7 years ago, she presented a paper on Christian Zionism at a meeting that happened of the Indian Ecumenical Network, Solidarity for Palestine. So over to you, Aruna. Please introduce our speakers so that we can go straight into the subject and give ourselves enough time for conversation. I think that would be the most important thing. And somewhere at the end of it, we would also like to get suggestions we can go forward. Sarah, welcome to your husband. He's a Palestinian. Am I right? Yeah. So welcome to the
Thank you.
Palestine.
Thank you.
All the way in Bolivia.
Thank you, Ranjan.
Okay, over to you, Aruna.
Okay. We will first hear, thank you, Ranjan, for this privilege of introducing the 2 speakers, especially on your birthday. It's very nice to be doing this. I consider it a big privilege, not only for me to introduce them to you, but for all of us to have the possibility of having a genuine voice from Palestine, a theologian, speak to us on Zionism. Munta Isaac is a Palestinian Christian. He's a pastor and a theologian. And he will speak of understanding Christian Zionism's beliefs and history. Anyone who has visited Palestine, many of us in this group have, will come out of Palestine a person who becomes as passionate as the Palestinians about their liberation. Their struggle is infectious because it is so well organized and been so systematic and has continued for so many years. And of course, the tragedy is, in spite of that, they haven't yet found full liberation themselves. So we are privileged now to hear people, a person from the region, speak to us about Christian Zionism. I think as Christians in India, this is an extremely important topic because many of us are almost afraid of showing our solidarity with Palestine. Many don't even know that there are Christians living in Palestine. Even the last time when Ranjan had a conference and I mentioned that there was this young Palestinian theologian speaking, several people wrote to me and said, are there Palestinians? I mean, are there Christians in Palestine? So it's so terrible, our history. And this is something of what colonialism has done to us. And of course, the way in which we have understood the Bible and Christian history and very easily linked it up with the Jewish history. So I'm sure now when Muntaz speaks to us, he's going to unravel some of that for us so that we won't make that mistake again and will understand how dangerous Zionism is, even when we as Christians repeat it as the mantra. Shall I introduce both, Ranjan? Okay, I'm not going to try to pronounce your name, Sarah. So I'll just say Sarah Dyke, and I hope you'll teach us your name. As she has said a little while ago, she is from Norway, but she grew up in Bolivia, and she studied theology in the UK, but has worked and taught in the Middle East, in Palestine. And Sarah will speak to us on the New Jerusalem towards a post-colonial critique of Christian Zionism. I think we as Indian Christians should listen very carefully to what she is saying because we fall into that same trap of believing that Christian Zionism is our history. So let us listen carefully and learn from these two speakers so that we can go back with a commitment to continue to support the Palestinian struggle, long struggle for liberation, for to be rid of this occupation that has just followed them all through their lives. So with those words, I welcome our speakers, thank them very much for speaking to us today, and I'm sure that they will leave a mark on our lives. So thank you, Ranjan, and over to the speakers.
Muntaz, the floor is yours.
Yes, so am I muted? No, I'm not. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. And it's so good to be with you. Thank you, Ranjan and friends, for Roger and others for this invitation. I've been browsing the names. We have people from the UK, from Australia, from Bolivia, from India, of course, the majority, and it's just wonderful. And thank you for taking the time and interest to be with us and to listen to our voice and cry as a Palestinian church about the situation here in Palestine and the impact of this movement, Christian Zionism, the impact it has on our lives as Palestinians. What I'm going to do is introduce you to the concept of Christian Zionism, why we have a problem with this concept as Palestinian Christians, why this movement, how it uses religion and the Bible for a political agenda, and then in the end, what should our response be, and how are we as Palestinian Christians responding to this movement or this phenomena called as Christian Zionism. I begin by stating the obvious. Yes, we exist And you're right, Aruna. So many times, whenever we speak or people meet us, they don't know that we exist. To me, the surprise should be if we did not exist, because Christianity began in Palestine. We need to remind ourselves. Christianity did not start in Europe or in the United States. Jesus was born just 5 minutes away from where I'm speaking right now. The surprise should be, and the tragedy should be, if there are no Christians left in the place where it all started. So yes, I speak as a Palestinian Christian living under the Israeli occupation, and I speak from a perspective where, as I said in my introduction, the other side of the wall, speaking from a position of being marginalized, oppressed, and persecuted even for the mere fact that I am a Palestinian, and sometimes even because I am a Palestinian Christian. And so as you hear my cry today, you will see that we have what we call as Palestinian Christians a double Nakba. A double Nakba because Nakba is the Palestinian word for catastrophe. Catastrophe is how we describe our Nakba, what happened to us in 1948 and what continues to be our reality since the founding of the State of Israel. Because while many people around the world, especially in Christian circles, celebrated the creation of the State of Israel, for us Palestinians, the creation of Israel was our Nakba, our catastrophe. Something had to give. We lost 78% of our historical land. More than 500,000 villages were completely destroyed. Our national existence and heritage was removed. At the time, it created a crisis of almost 800,000 refugees. By the way, among them, many Palestinian Christian refugees, and of course, many were killed in that war. And since then, we've been living in the impact of that, which continues today, where I speak from the West Bank, Palestinian territory, a land that is torn apart by the Israeli separation wall and the many Israeli settlements, where in such a small area, you have this map in front of you, and believe me, this is maybe a neighborhood in Delhi, New Delhi. Palestine is a very small land in comparison to India, so keep that in mind. And it's so much fragmented by the Israeli military and the presence of many Israeli colonies. Israeli colonies are Jewish-only colonies where we cannot not just live there, but even we can only access there for cheap labor. And these settlements are connected by a system of roads that sometimes cannot even drive on these roads. And as I speak, please remember that the occupation defines our reality, and as a result, inequality and injustice on the ground is our daily norm. Whether it manifests itself in how natural resources are distributed. We have a problem with water because on average, an Israeli person uses 5-6 times more water than a Palestinian. A reality of checkpoints all the times, even when going from one Palestinian town to the other. Land confiscation is something we need to deal with on a constant level by the Israeli authorities, usually to build either a settlement or the separation wall, or even the simple right of living in our homeland. You will hear next from Sarah, who's married to a Palestinian, but she cannot move to live in Palestine because the Israeli authorities will not give her the visa. They control the borders, even though her husband is a Bethlehemite Palestinian whose family has been here for hundreds of years, if not more. I think there is some distraction. Whereas any Jewish person around the world can immigrate to our land and consider it home and have more rights than Tony or myself. And we simply ask, is this fair? Now, why do I call it a double Nakba? I call it a double Nakba because the Christian world, our sisters and brothers around the world, rather than supporting or feeling with us or just siding with justice, we don't want them to side with us because we're Christians, just side with justice and human dignity. The creation of Israel was celebrated as a divine miracle, as a divine intervention, and the creation of Israel continues to be celebrated as a divine miracle. Christians today continue to support the state of Israel on a constant basis because of a system of interpretation of the Bible we call Christian Zionism, or they call sometimes Christian Zionism, based on certain principles that I have here on the screen. And these principles were translated from a theological position into an aggressive and strong support to the state of Israel, even to the occupation, and turning a blind eye to the suffering and oppression of the Palestinians. Statements like these define how many Christians around the world think of the state of Israel. And I want to read them, and as I read them, I want to ask you to consider what these statements are telling me as a Palestinian, who lives in this land, who's been living in his land for hundreds of years. It's not just that this is land, our homeland. This is the land of our ancestors, the land that we have inherited, that we have farmed for hundreds of years and more. Statements like the Abrahamic covenant continues with the Jewish people today and by association with the state of Israel. This is a very common belief in many Christian circles, even in most Christian circles. And we ask, but what about us Palestinians? What is this telling me as a Palestinian? Statements like the creation of Israel in 1948 is a fulfillment of prophecy or is a sign to God's faithfulness to the Jewish people. Again, I read a statement like this and I hear it all the time in Christian circles. And Palestinians wonder if this is true. Why would God, the God we consider a loving God, do this to us Palestinians just to fulfill a prophecy? Does this make sense? Or that the creation of Israel is a sign to God's faithfulness to the Jewish people. Does this indicate that this is a sign of God's judgment on the Palestinians? It's also common to say, if you bless Israel, God will bless you. If you stand against Israel, God will curse you. And this is 101, how to use the Bible or the religious text, any religious text or political purpose. It's not about loving the Jewish people, but it's about gaining God's favor. You do it if you support Israel. And you see, we tell people, avoid God's curse. So you should support Israel. Again, we're manipulating people. And of course, the statement that many believe that God gave the land to the Jewish people as an eternal possession. The language of Jews have a divine right. As I said, this is translated into a strong and aggressive political movement that supports Israel, even finances the Jewish immigrations. We're talking about billions of dollars over the years, hundreds of dollars every year. That goes from churches, usually evangelical churches, into the state of Israel, into the military, into settlement projects. And please hear me what I'm saying. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars on an annual basis from churches, not to support churches in Palestine, or hospitals, or schools, or human rights projects, or the mission of the church, but to support a colonizing force. And we need to pause and think of that. When the American President Trump moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, breaking the international law and going against what many countries, he did it, as he said, motivated by his willingness to thank the evangelicals. He didn't do it for the Jewish people. He said, I did it for the evangelicals. This is how strong this evangelical lobby is, or this Christian Zionist movement is. And as I have been saying so far, in the midst of this theology and strong movement, we as Palestinian Christians have suffered. We have been ignored. We have been even dehumanized. We don't belong. It is as if the land is empty. It is as if we don't exist. This is what I always call the myth of an empty land, that many Christians around the world believe. And whereas, in the beginning, Aruna said, many people are not aware that Palestinian Christians exist. Believe me, Aruna and all, when Christians speak about our land, it is as if nobody exists in the land other than the Jewish people. Think of slogans that were famous not just in Zionist circles, but in Christian Zionist circles. Slogans like a land without a people for a people without a land. Now we must ask, was the land really without people? No, of course not. The land had people, had Palestinians. The question is, did they know that the land had people? And of course they knew. But for these people who say these things, whether Zionist or Christian Zionist, the land, yes, maybe have people, but they are a complete irrelevant. As a journalist once said, Ben White, for the Zionists, Palestine was empty, not literally, but in terms of people of equal worth. So consider, for example, as I said, the land was empty, not literally, but in terms of people of equal worth. And as I said, this finds its way today in more subtle language. For example, discussions like this in mainstream media: do Jews have a divine right to Israel's land? This is a very common discussion. This is something that's debated in churches. It's often called Israel's land, and it's often dealt with as if it's empty. In this particular example, and let me illustrate the problem to you, I actually wrote Christianity Today, the website that ran this discussion, a discussion between two American theologians, a white American and a Messianic Jewish American. And it's typical. They discuss our land as if it's empty. And I said, I am a Palestinian. Can I respond? And oh, by the way, I'm doing my PhD on the topic. I was doing it at Oxford back then. And believe it or not, even when I contacted them, introduced myself, I was not given the chance to respond. Because yes, we exist, but to many of these, our opinion doesn't matter. They discuss our land from the comfort of their offices as if it's empty. They tell us what the Bible says and we have to accept it. And our perspectives do not really matter. I've often called this the original wall, meaning that we have for a long time been put on the other side of the wall, discriminated against. And I'm talking both ways about the physical, ugly, concrete wall you find in Palestine today that isolates Palestinians from the rest of the world, as if we're dangerous to be protected from. Pilgrims who come to the Holy Land in the pre-COVID-19 era, of course, the majority wouldn't even go to Bethlehem. And if they go for 2 hours to visit the Nativity Church where Jesus was born and leave. And that wall communicates either that we don't exist or, shielding us, or as if, these people are dangerous. You see, this is what walls do. They separate and then they dehumanize, as if the Arabs or Palestinians are more dangerous or are to be feared. This is the true reality of the wall. And once you dehumanize people, it becomes easy and convenient not just to dehumanize them, but then even to justify violence against them and take what's happening in Gaza as an example. So this is really how, in reality, Christian Zionism functions. An ideology that employs religion for its purposes. It's not simply about a theological notion of a chosen people, but now we can even talk about a chosen state. Israel can do no wrong. Israel is to be supported. Israel is to be protected over against everybody else. And that's how, and that's why Israel can go away with breaking so many international laws and UN resolutions, because it gets the protection of many, because they are perceived as superior. Someone once said a Christian leader in the United States, a prominent Christian leader, is a Christian Zionist leader. To stand against Israel is to stand against God. This is the doctrine that is indoctrinated in churches, in Sunday schools, in youth groups. And this is what leads to this widespread support of Israel in churches, and it's translated into this political support to Israel. If you stand against Israel, we stand against God. And as he said, even I go back to this example. Think for a moment of the question: do Jews have a divine right to Israel's land? Because if the answer to this question is yes, Jews have a divine right, where does that leave me as a Palestinian? Because if I say no, I would actually be saying no to God. And you see how this theology immediately put me in a position where I am even opposing God just by my mere existence, because I challenge I stand in the way of God's chosen people. The hypocrisy of these Christian Zionists, I would say, is that they go crazy when Muslims use this language, but it's perfectly fine in their logic to apply it on Israel. And hence we create this impression that this is a battle between the gods, the God of Jews or the God of Judeo-Christian God and the God of Islam. And this is a very dangerous mentality. And when I say the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition, please let us understand what is meant by that in their mind. It is often a code for cultural superiority, maybe even genetic superiority. We're better. We have God on our side. We have God's support. We are the privileged. When Trump was running for presidency, someone made this prayer over him. It's all over YouTube. Only 2 nations have been in a relationship with God in history: Israel and the United States of America. So it's. I hope you see this. This is about now countries being in a relationship with God, and of course, can you go wrong when you are in a relationship with God? And to me, one of the strongest, most clear quotes that illustrates this mentality was given by Mike Pence, the American Vice President, who, by the way, is an evangelical anti-Christian Zionist, self-declared. We're not just saying he is, but he is. He says that when he visited Israel, Jerusalem a few years ago, or 2 years, I think, ago, he made this statement in the Israeli Knesset, or equivalent to the parliament. And please read carefully what he's saying. He says, "We stand with Israel because your cause is our cause. Your values are our values, and your fight is our fight. We stand with Israel because we believe in right over wrong, in good over evil, and in liberty over tyranny." See how the world is divided into two parts. And who are the Palestinians in this world? Who are we? We are the wrong, the evil, the tyrant. Whereas he represents the good side, the pure side, the side that's seeking liberty. And the irony here is that we Palestinians, all that we're asking for is liberty. To me, I see so much arrogance in this statement. But of course, the sad part is how Palestinians are dehumanized, how Palestinians are portrayed in an easy way as the wrong, the evil, the tyrant. These kind of attacks and dehumanizing on Christians also extend to Palestinian Christians. You cannot imagine the amount of pressure we face as Palestinian Christians just because we criticize Israel. All of these are attacks and labels that were given to us by Christians, sometimes by Israeli media, but oftentimes by Christian media around the world. We've been called all sorts of things: liars, socialists, anti-Semitic, replacement liberals, anti-Jewish, theological terrorists, political theology, and all of these things invented just because we are Palestinian Christians. Many times we've been silenced, and when I say silenced, I mean we've been invited, then the invitation is withdrawn, whether it's to speak in a church or a mission conference. And the reason why the invitation is withdrawn, as we have been told verbatim, it is because you are a Palestinian. And I can't help but think, what happened to us Christians, that we now discriminate not just against people, but even against our sisters and brothers in Christ because of who they are and because of their nationality. We are being silenced because we pose a challenge to the common stereotype. We break the stereotype. It's easy, much easier, much more convenient to portray all Palestinians as terrorists, as Muslims. Yet here we come, we are Palestinians, but we're Christians. And we insist that, yes, while religious extremism in all religions is a problem, in Palestine and Israel, the occupation is the core issue. It's not religion or as if it's a theological battle. We challenge these Islamophobia, and we challenge using the Bible for political purposes. As here we have the Israeli ambassador to the UN holding a Bible to defend Israel's right to break the international law and build settlements. To us, this is unacceptable. This is our Bible, and the God we know in the Bible, the God that we know in the Hebrew scripture, and as many Jewish activists support us with, is a God of justice. Kairos Palestine says, therefore, it's a document by Palestinian Christian theologians and activists and really influential people. We declare that any use of the Bible to legitimize or support political options and positions that are based upon injustice, imposed by one person on another or by one people on another, transform religion into human ideology and strip the word of God of its holiness, its universality, and truth. For us, and I here move to our response, my final part of my presentation, justice does matter. Justice really matters. Any theology we have, if it trumps, if it challenges the biblical teachings of Jesus of love and equality and justice, then we must rethink it. If my theology leads me to discriminate, to separate between people, to privilege certain people over the other, whether it's because their DNA or their nationality or whatever, something is seriously wrong with that theology. Something is, justice matters to God. It's a biblical principle. I strongly believe that justice is God's norm for the prosperity of any community, for the safety of any community. As we see here in Deuteronomy 16, justice matters to God. Justice matters when it comes to the land itself. We cannot just relativize justice as some Christian Zionists do, as we have here in this quote. We don't have time to read it in full. But what he's basically saying, that biblical justice means the land belongs to Israel, and we have to accept that. And no, I cannot accept that this is the God that we meet in the Bible, the God we meet in Jesus. This quote is basically saying, if Palestinians do not accept that this is Israel's land, they are foundationally unjust and themselves resisted by God. And again, how convenient to say from a position of power and privilege that you, the oppressed, should accept God's plan or God will be against you. I lament that this is coming from the church. I lament that the church says these things to us. I lament the fact that the church is okay with the occupation, with the oppression of Palestinians. Our message has been and continues to be that God calls us to be ambassadors of justice, of truth, of peace and reconciliation. When Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, Do we take him seriously? Do we take him seriously? Or, just ignore statements like this? Peacemaking is challenging. And many Christians have a very, I fear, naive issue about understanding of peace, as if it's this, be nice to one another, or let's pray for Palestine and Israel that they get. No, that's not peacemaking. To me, peacemaking is risky. It means you have to step to the other side and listen. It means also you have to take a stand. You have to take a stand with truth and justice, and you have to speak truth to power. You cannot claim to be a peacemaker and see oppression and injustice and simply say, I'm going to pray to both sides that they get along. That's not peacemaking. That's empowering the oppressors. And in conclusion, I want to say that our response to the ideology of Christian Zionism, an exclusive ideology that privileges certain people over the other, our response to that ideology should always be an inclusive ideology where we emphasize that this is God's land. This is not anybody's land, any nation or religion or ethnicity. It belongs to God. And rather than saying this is mine, we should learn how to share it. We should learn how to share. And to me, this is different than dividing. Dividing the land means putting Palestinians in isolation camps or putting us behind closed walls. This is the so-called proposed Trump deal. And this is not what will bring peace. Sharing the land means sharing its resources equally and having the same rights. There should be no discrimination, no second-class citizens. There should be no law that applies to the Palestinian and a law that applies on the Israeli, which is what we have right now, or a law that applies on the Israeli Jew versus a law that applies on the Palestinian with an Israeli citizen. What we have in the land right now is what our South African friends continue to describe as apartheid, discrimination. And our response isn't to get rid of the Jews, rather an ideology where we share the land with one another. That is God's vision to the land. And we will continue to hope against all odds, because this is the land of hope, that this is possible. Because this is the only alternative. Either the cycle of violence, as Kairos put it, or we both learn how to live in peace with one another. We continue to hope and dream of a new society. This is our vision that we get through our faith. Kairos Palestine also says, this is very important quote, even though we have fought one another in the recent past and still struggle today, we are able to love and live together. We can organize our political life with all its complexity according to the logic of love and power after ending the occupation and establishing justice. So yes, our end goal is this new society where we live together, where we share the land together, but it begins by ending the occupation and establishing justice. And that should be the priority of the church, I believe, that we should put an end to the occupation. My plea to you in India and everywhere, is this what you promote in our theology, in our churches, even in our prayer and in our actions? And just this year, this summer, a group of activist theologians, pastors and clergy and theologians and activists and lay came with this, Palestinians and from the globe, came with a document called Cry for Hope that I encourage you to read and sign and endorse, cryforhope.org. And this document gives very practical steps where we can really be agents of peace as Christians, and where we can not just say Christian Zionism as a theology is wrong or as a concept, but where we do the right work in the land, move towards this vision that the church here has of one day sharing the land and establishing the ideals of the kingdom of God in this land. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to interacting with you more in the Q&A section.
Thank you, Mukhtar, for that the theology that comes from the experience of oppression and injustice. And in that, you are bringing us a new theology of shared land and of justice and peace together. Let us move on to the next presentation. That's from Sarah.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my presentation? Yeah, perfect.
Yes.
So, thank you so much. Greetings from South America, Bolivia. I'm from Bolivia. Cochabamba is my city, and I'm married to a Palestinian Christian called Tony, and he's right here with me. And it's really early in the morning here in South America, but I just had 2 cups of coffee, so I'm really ready to share with you another perspective from Christian Zionism. And what I'm trying to do is show you Christian Zionism and Orientalism. It's reading Christian Zionism with post-colonial lenses. So it's trying to put post-colonial critique within the message of Christian Zionism. And just briefly, let me tell you what we're gonna be doing. So it's just three parts. Basically, I'm gonna state my thesis about radical eschatology, and I'll explain that in a minute. Then I'm gonna show methodology, how we're gonna read Christian Zionist texts with Orientalism as a method. And then I'm gonna talk about the argument, seeing how post-colonialism is a great way to see Christian Zionism and to understand Christian Zionism. So let's begin with the thesis. And I would like to start with an author and his book. And actually, he's from Portugal, and his name is Surara. So in 1444, Gomes Eanes de Azurara was his name. He was the official royal chronicler of Portugal, and he was commissioned to write about how Portugal was starting trafficking sub-Saharan African slaves to Portugal. No? And in this book, the one that I'm showing in the picture, The Chronicle of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea, Surara is narrating how, through the courage and the royal army and the genius of Prince Henry, Portugal is entering this world power domination. So back in those days, in medieval times, to be a world power was meant engaging in human trafficking and slavery. So he's trying to narrate how the courageous Prince Henry starting this world dominance by starting the slave trade in Portugal. And while he's narrating this with a Catholic undertone, he starts crying. So in the middle of his narration, he's saying, "I'm sorry, Lord, for crying." And what's really interesting about this narration is that while he's crying, he quickly repents from those tears. So let me read you that part. So he's telling us about the next day, how on the 8th of the month of August, very early in the morning, by reason of the heat, the seamen began to make ready their boats and to take out those captives and carry them on shore as they were commanded, so the African slaves. And these people placed together in that field were a marvelous sight. But then he's saying, but what kind of heart could be so hard as not to be pierced with the piteous feeling to see that company? For some kept their heads low and their faces bathed in tears, looking one upon another. Others stood groaning very dolorously, looking up to the height of heaven, fixing their eyes upon it, crying loudly as if they were asking for help from the Father of nature. Others struck their faces upon the ground, and though we could not understand the words that they were saying, we could understand the measure of their sadness. So he's saying about the African arrival to Portugal, and then he starts crying. "I pray thee," then he says, "that my tears may not wrong my conscience, for it is not their religion, but their humanity that makes me weep in pity for their suffering." And Surara is going to start a theological tradition here, where theology is going to be a wall, is going to become a wall for not understanding the other, because he's going to use theology to legitimize the pain of African brothers and sisters. So he sees them as imago Dei, he sees them as made in the image of God, but at the same time, he needs to legitimize that a Christian nation like Portugal is engaging on slavery. So how does he legitimize this? We will call it radical soteriology, radical salvation doctrine. He's going to say, okay, we are making slaves out of African bodies, but actually we're Christianizing the nation. We're making them Christian. So what we're doing, it's okay. So this is what he's trying to say with this part of the narration. So the Infante who was there during the arrival of Africans. The Infante was there, and he's trying to explain why the Infante wasn't sad. And he's saying, well, because he reflected with great pleasure upon the salvation of those souls that before were lost. And certainly his expectation was not in vain. For as we said before, as soon as they understood our language, they turned Christians with very little ado. And I who put together this history into this volume saw in the town of Lagos boys and girls, the children and grandchildren of those first captives born in this land as good and true Christians, as if they had directly descended from the beginnings of the dispensation of Christ, from those who were baptized. So we see a theological tradition that's going to be repeated over and over again, that the colonization of the Americas, the colonizations of Africa is going to be used for the salvation of Africans or indigenous people in, for example, Latin America. And I think Jennings, in a powerful book, The Christian Imagination, he captures this really well. So I'm going to read a quote by him. Surara deploys a theoretical strategy of containment, holding slave suffering inside a Christian story that will be recycled by countless theologians and intellectuals of every colonialist nation. The telos, the goal, and the denouncement of the event will be enacted as an order of salvation, ordo salutis. African captivity leads to African salvation. And this is something that we're going to read in a lot of theological texts of within colonialism. And I want to give an example actually from South America, from where I'm from. And this is a quote by a Jesuit. He's a Spanish Jesuit, and he was working as a missionary in colonial Peru. And this is what he says. In this regard, a wise man once said that what a man does to marry off an ugly daughter is give her a large dowry. This is what God has done with the land, endowing it with great wealth and mind, so that whoever could find it by these means. So he's basically using divine will, salvation, the doctrine of providence, divine providence, to say, well, God wanted the Americas to be Christianized, so he made it very rich, in gold and silver and mines, so that Spaniard people could come, and take away the treasures of the land and Christianize the people there. So it's a theological strategy of containment, of disassociating with human rights, with the suffering of others in the pursuit of salvation. It is soteria without koinonia, meaning it's salvation without Christian fellowship. So we see here that the point of these Christians is the salvation of the people, but not the koinonia of the church, the fellowship of understanding each other's intimacy, Christian intimacy. That's not part of the agenda, just this soteriology, this idea that we're Christianizing the world. It doesn't matter if we're a slave in the world in the process, we are Christianizing the world. And I spent quite some time talking about this because we see soteriology, salvation, working as a theological wild card, as a trump card. So whenever we don't want to talk about uncomfortable things about injustice or human rights violations or slavery, we're going to put the theological card right there and say, well, actually, we're working towards the salvation of these people from the indigenous Americas, in the case of the quote I've just read, or in the case of Surara, in African captivity and slavery. And the same thing happens in Christian Zionist discourse, but in this time, we don't use soteriology, we don't use the doctrine of salvation, we're going to use eschatology. You're going to see with some examples I'm going to give you that eschatology is going to work as a wild card. So we're not going to talk about occupation. We're not going to talk about human rights violations. We're going to talk about end times. So my husband here saying, say what eschatology means. So eschatology means end times theology. So what is God going to do in the end times? So we're going to see with some examples how Christian Zionism is going to use that end times card to kind of disassociate, dehumanize Palestinian lives and Muslim lives and the Middle East for the end times theology that they're going to be pursuing. And to do so, to read Christian Zionism with this post-colonial lens, I want to present to you a methodology, very shortly, don't worry, it's going to be long, called Orientalism. So Orientalism is it's a book written by Edward Said, and Edward Said, he's a Palestinian, and actually he's considered the father of post-colonial studies with this book. And in 1978, influenced by the news coverage actually about the Arab-Israeli war of 1973, he wrote this book based on this experience of being in America while the news were covering the Israeli-Arab war, but also growing up in the Middle East. So his two experiences, living in the West and growing up in the Middle East, he writes this book called Orientalism. And he starts with the late 18th century and starts analyzing Western discourse about the East or about the Orient. And he realizes that this discourse, this message that the West says about the East has always been characterized by an imperial language, an imperial relationship between the West and the East. So Orientalism starts with Napoleon invading Egypt, and how Napoleon starts a discourse where we know the Orient really well. So he starts saying, he actually brings academic, within his army, he also brings scholars to study the East. And he starts this academic tradition saying, because we know the East so well, we can govern the East. Like we know the Orient more than the Orient knows itself. So it's Orientalism comes like a conceptual repertoire, like a lot of images about the Orient that are portrayed by the West. And I think, well, yeah, influenced by Nietzsche and his studies of like how truth is embedded in language. Said says, well, there's two kinds of Orients. There's the actual Orient, the actual place, the Middle East, the countries, the differences between those countries. There's the actual Orient, and then there's the eternal Orient that is going to be talked about in Western culture and in Western discourse. So this eternal Orient never develops. Said realizes that whenever the West talks about the Orient, it's as if it's talking about a backward Orient, uncivilized Orient. It never develops. It doesn't have history. It's monolithic. It's one. So this is a power structure. This is knowledge and power. And here Said uses a lot of Foucault in this. in that he's analyzing how knowledge is used with power to say, because we know the Orient so well, we can have power over it. And this power of containment needs to have a lot of generalizations. Like, to have power over something, you need to generalize it and say it's actual truth. And Said talks about this as these generalizations as a binary opposition. So there are Westerners and there are Orientals. So this is what he sees in the discourse of Orientalism. The former, the Westerners, dominate, and the latter must be dominated, which usually means having the land occupied, their internal affairs rigidly controlled, their blood and treasure put at the disposal of one or another Western power. So in Orientalism, there's these big generalizations that are always about the East and the West. So in one sense, the West is portrayed as rational, developed, humane, superior, and the East is portrayed as underdeveloped, inferior. There's this idea of the exotic Orient, the backward, the uncivilized Orient, and always difference will be interpreted as danger. So because the Orient is the opposite of the West, is a dangerous, exotic place that we must try to control. So this is Orientalist discourse. And Said doesn't just say this, he proves it with actual texts. And here's one text that he uses as a proof. And actually, this is going to be like a major book written by Cromer that is going to be cited a lot. Like, a lot of Orientalists after this book are going to cite this book. And it's kind of like, it's where this Orientalist wisdom is going to start. And actually, he was... the author of this book, Cromer, he was a British consul general, and here's his Orientalist wisdom. Sir Alfred Lyell once said to me, accuracy is abhorrent to the Oriental mind. Every Anglo-Indian should always remember this maxim. Want of accuracy, which easily degenerates into untruthfulness, is in fact the main characteristic of the Oriental mind. The European is a bold reasoner. His statements of fact are he is a natural logician. The mind of the Oriental, however, on the other hand, like his picturesque streets, is immensely wanting in symmetry. So here we have a generalization about, imagine, like, the mind of a whole continent is the Oriental mind that we see is unrational. But Said doesn't only say, well, this happened, in colonial 19th century. He sees this with Princeton scholars, like Princeton professors are writing books. They're actually experts on the Orient, and they're saying similar things as Cromer. For example, to illustrate this, I'm going to read a quote by Manfred Halpern, arguing that even though all human thought progressions can be reduced to 8, the Islamic mind only has 4. Or Moorberger, presuming that since the Arabic language is much given to rhetoric, Arabs are consequently incapable of true thought. Or another book, a PhD study by Samia Hamadi in her work Temperament and Character in the Arabs. She argues that because the Arabs lives in a hard and frustrating environment, he has little chance to develop his potentialities and define his position in society, holds little belief in progress and change, and finds salvation only in the thereafter. So for Said, the result of this constant talking about the Oriental mind and the Arab mind, it's a relationship between knowledge and power in the interest of one difference, that one setting of Arabs off from everyone else as subject matter for study and analysis. They can be controlled more easily. So in this power dynamic, if we make generalizations about the Arab world, about Islam, about Muslims, about Orientals, then it is more easy for us to control. It's like Jared Kushner saying that he can make a peace deal or the deal of the century because he read 25 books about it. So see how knowledge about the Orient is used to put power over the Orient. And the question is, do we see the same generalization, the same Orientalism within Christian Zionist discourse? And the answer is yes. And sadly, we don't only see this discourse of Orientalism, these massive generalizations, but we also see this coupled with divine connotations, with religious language. And that makes it even more painful to read. Here is, for example, a book that is published. Actually, this is a book that's published quite recently, 2018. Like, I'm not giving Christian Zionists from the 70s or the 80s. This is 2018 book by Christian Zionists, and it was written in celebration of Israel's 70th anniversary. And I think this quote is a great example of this idea of generalizing people from the Orient into very specific negative connotations. So here in this article by Mark Bailey, he is giving reasons why Christians should support the state of Israel. And this is what he says. This is the second reason. Second, the Arabs have millions of square miles and plenty of room to live in 17 different countries of their choice. whereas the Jews have only a small piece of real estate to live out their ideals. No one, including the Arab countries, ever thought of the land as separate Arab country until the Jews began returning to the region. Third, the Jews need homeland. They can protect from the they can protect themselves for their own self-determination. So imagine here, he's saying that the Arabs, 17 different countries are just portrayed as the Arabs. So if there's Palestinian Christians like my husband and I living in Palestine, we must leave to other Arab nations because we're the same. We're all the Arabs, and it's okay. They should accept us. And he carries on with these generalizations, and I want to read a bit more about it. He's saying that is the consternation is the fact that countries with a population 10 times bigger than Israel repeatedly refuse to accept any Arab refugees from Israel, even though they speak the same language, share the same culture, and practice the religion of Islam. So see this generalization that they're all the same. These exotic, Orient, dangerous, they're all the same. They're the Arab countries that must accept refugees. And then he carries on, and this is very important for us to understand, and Said points it really well, that Israel as a country will represent the West in the Middle East. So all the characteristics of the West, the rational West, the intelligent West, the civilized West, is going to be Israel within the uncivilized Arab nations. So, and this is very portrayed in this quote I'm going to read right now. In many ways, Israel is a unique expression of democracy in the Middle East. It allows significant freedoms and pluralism of political and religious expression, unlike many, if not all, of the surrounding countries. The concepts of democracy, the rule of law, freedom of religion, speech, and human rights are core values shared by the United States and a limited number of other countries. So you see, the West is represented as this rational, humane entity, and then it's everyone else. Everyone else meaning all the other Arab nations. And within this Christian Zionist discourse, Palestinians are also going to be generalized, and they're going to be generalized as Muslims, as Munder was saying, like, there's this generalization that there's Palestinian Christians, like there's difference between Palestinians. In some writings, we have people saying, I couldn't believe that there were Palestinian Christians and that they loved Jesus, or that there was a Palestinian that could love a Jew. So there's this big, massive generalization about Palestinians. And look at, let me read this quote that portrays this really well. Why would anyone choose to side with Muslim people who adhere to Islam and the false prophet Muhammad against the Jews and their Hebrew scriptures? To connect to the latter, Jesus summarized all three sections of the Hebrew canon as leaning towards him. Why would one not want to show support for a country where the Hebrew scriptures are still held in honor and the opportunity to witness from multiple millennia of revealed truth? So here he's making the issue a political issue, a human rights issue, a historical issue into a religious issue. So as Christians, we should support the Jews because the Jews have the scriptures, and we should be against anything Islam. And this is Islamophobia. It's another chapter of anti-Semitism, but it's still present on Christian Zionist discourse. And what it's doing is it's dividing people, it's generalizing, it's making claims that don't help us to connect intimately with one another. So that is the problem with Christian Zionism. And here's where the theological wildcard is going to come. So when we present Israel and the creation of Israel as a miracle of God, there's nothing else we can say after that, right? So anything that questions that claim that it's a miracle, or anything that says, well, wait, there's something else that I would like to talk about, it becomes in opposition. You become as opponent of the plan of God in the Middle East. And they are very careful to show us this dichotomy, this distinction. Again, I'm going to read now a quote by Darrell Bock and Mitch Glaser. They're PhDs. They're big on biblical studies. They've done their work, but they want us to believe that the Bible must impact and inform our views on contemporary issues like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So in this book, they asked 6 well-qualified authors to help delve deeper into what the Bible teaches us about the conflict. And what the Bible teaches us about the conflict is that Israel is a miracle of God. So these kind of quotations, I will call them restorative citations or doxological ideas, are repeated over and over in Christian Zionist discourse. So we don't really have conversations about human rights violations, about the constant expansion of Israel and the constant demolition of houses and children being jailed in Israeli jails and freedom of speech. We don't have all these conversations because we are just told Israel is the divine miracle of God. And that's where the theological wildcard functions really well, as it did with colonial salvation theology. I hope I'm not moving too fast, but so when we established this idea of Israel in 1948, So when we establish this idea, it's very hard to move forward. And that's where the eschatology card comes in, this idea of end times. Here's another quote where you see, nonetheless, it is the conviction of the authors of these chapters that there is a way forward, which begins with a deeper understanding of the role of Israel in God's plan. So the role of Israel in God's plan is what makes us support the state of Israel. But here they're very careful not to tell us what that role is. We just know that God wants to establish a state for his second coming, or that Jesus is going to be this Davidic king and he's going to inherit the nation of Israel. But actually, when we read the Bible, we know that it's not just Israel that Jesus is going to inherit, but he's going to inherit the cosmos, like the whole thing, like the whole earth. But they want us to focus on the role of Israel in God's plan. And they're very careful not to tell us what that role is, because a lot of Christian Zionists have in the past, and they used a lot of prophetic speculation of what that role would be, and it always never happens. So they're careful not to say what that role of Israel in end times will be, because of like previous, let's say, prophetic visions that actually never even happened. And a great example is a book that was translated in 30 different languages, a very, very popular book within evangelicalism in America in the 1970s, a book called The Late Great Planet Earth. Maybe some of you even heard it or read it. I know it was very popular in the 80s in South America. But he's basically trying to say how Israel, the establishment of the kingdom of the nation of Israel, is the fuse of Armageddon. So the idea is that in end times theology, when Israel becomes a nation, it's going to ignite a big war. You know, the biggest war the world has ever seen, Armageddon, and that's going to make Jesus come back. So it's the second coming. So that's what he's saying on this quote. The crux of the case is that this physical restoration to the land is directly associated with triggering the hostility, which brings out a great judgment upon all nations and the Messiah's return to set up God's kingdom. In other words, it is the presence of the reborn nation of Israel flourishing in prosperity that excites a great enemy from the uttermost north of Palestine to launch an attack upon them, which sets off the last war of all time. This war is to be ended with such a display of divine intervention that a great many of the surviving Gentiles and Jews put their whole trust in the true Messiah, Jesus Christ. So here it's a very Orientalist quote in the sense that their relationship, the Christian relationship to the Orient, to the Middle East, is functional. And this is what I call radical eschatology. So instead of talking about human beings living in the Middle East, having lives and children and dreams and hopes, we're talking about the end times and wars and Armageddon and how the faith is going to play a role in these end times and Jesus is going to come back. It's a functional ideology. And you'll see even when they write about it, it's as if they're in a Roman Colosseum and they're watching a war, because they talk a lot about excitement, like how Christians we should be excited about the Middle East and what's going to happen and the wars that are going to come. And the authors talk a lot about it's a game in language, it's excitement, it's like entertainment. But the thing is, I have a daughter, and I don't think I want to tell her the gospel ends with a radical eschatology, an end-time war that's going to destroy all the Middle East, and there's never going to be peace in the Middle East because Jews and Arabs will never get along until Jesus comes back. This is not the message of true reconciliation and gospel and good news I want to tell the next generation of Christians living in the land. And I think this is why it's so important to deconstruct this Christian Zionist message. And I agree with Robert Smith. He says the biggest problem with Christian Zionism it is that it values an ideological system, a biblical interpretation of end times, over the lives and well-being of actual people. And that's the problem. We're not having the real conversations we should be having as Christians, conversations about integrity, about hope, resilience, conversations about how we can make your life better, how the news of the gospel talks about salvation with intimacy, with Christian fellowship. We're not talking about that. We're talking about wars and the establishment of states and Armageddons, and we're not talking about the lives and well-beings of actual people. And that is why deconstructing the message of Christian Zionism is so crucial, not just for Palestinians, but for Israelis also, not just for Christians, Palestinians, but also for Messianic Jews, because what we are realizing as a global community with global problems like climate change and a pandemic is that whatever we do to others, we're doing to ourselves. So to destroy nature is to destroy ourselves. To destroy another person is to destroy ourselves. So we cannot be as Christian praying for the army and praying for the establishment and the expansion of Israel when we're realizing that that is going to destroy Israelis as well as Palestinians. So I just wanted to end with with a prayer that we as Christians pray for Christian Zionists and evangelicalism in general, because obviously this influence of Christian Zionism is all over the world with missionaries. We've seen it in South America a lot with my husband. But I really want to pray that they have a second conversion, like the conversion Peter had, where he realized that God is not a God of favoritism. Peter had to realize that God is for everyone, for the message of the gospel to arrive to the Gentile world. And I want to finish with that realization. It's so powerful, and it's written in Acts 10, verses 34 to 35. I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right.
Thank you, Sarah, for that well presented view on eschatology, the radical eschatology, and how you have, with the help of the postmodern framework, critiqued how the West looks at the Orient, and then your conclusion that we need a theology where all are related and realize that destroying somebody else is to destroy ourselves. And so we talk about a holistic, just world. Friends, we have heard two good presentations, and the time is now open for us to make our own comments or to ask important questions. My network is not so good, so in case I miss out, I'll request Ranjan to step in. Thank you. Yes, John Dale.
Thank you so much indeed. I congratulate all the presenters. I think that they have been one of the most brilliant explanations and expositions on the issue. My question is to myself really, and to everybody else. This end times thesis, extreme evangelical Zionism, is unfortunately on the increase, not only in Bible Belt America, but in India. I face this every day whenever I do a posting on this issue. The amount of mail that comes back, there's a end times physiology used. What strategy can we use to challenge this interpretation of the text of the New Testament and of the Old Testament? How to disabuse these people and to show them the violence that happens? Because we can discuss tautology and theology till kingdom come, but the violence, the bodies, the terror is real, palpable. How do we bring this to their attention? Not to ask them to change the thesis, but to see at least the wounds that have been inflicted on a people and a nation and a land.
Thank you, John. Is there someone having a similar kind of thought or comment to make?
I'm Jeremiah Anderson from Bangalore.
Yes, Jeremiah.
Sir, we all do agree. First of all, I thank the two presenters for the excellent presentation of the issues there. See, if Bible is a book which speaks about God's relationship to human beings and our response, so our daily experiences with God become part of the revealed word to us. Now, why I say this is, I'm sure that many write diaries, their daily diaries, at least from the age of 15, if they have written for a certain period of time. They don't record only what they have eaten for the day or what they have enjoyed, but how God has acted in their life, maybe to get a job, maybe in a difficult situation. These become experiences that God, there is an experience. And we move on from God of Israel, Isaac, Jacob, to the fathers of our own thing, where we have got that in our mind to start either a prayer or a theology or anything connected with the people of Israel. So I really agree with the presenters that it's time to move on from there. Thank you.
Can I ask a question, John?
Yeah, please, Aruna, please go ahead.
Sorry, I would like to know what are we going to do now? Because there was in the chat box itself some of the comments coming about just how our churches are just engrossed in the Zionism. So you can't have a conversation without being told that you can't take the stand because this is against the Bible, this is against the will of God. So how do we transform that is the question. How do we change the thinking of ordinary Christians in the pew?
Would any of our presenters want to respond to these two questions? Don't respond to my question.
Yes, thank you both. But I think I want to respond briefly to your question, John, and I think also what I think Reverend Jeremiah said. I think that what all of this tells us is that theology matters. How we interpret the Bible matters. And many times I think we have left theology over the Bible, and these usually fundamentalist conservative churches are growing and are interpreting, and I fear many times that we have left the arena for these groups to interpret and write, and I think we should counter that with strong theological kingdom-minded movements that reflect the heart of God to people. So we have a long way to do when it comes to theology. I think that's my quick comment. And yes, I don't know what can we do and how can we counter that. Oftentimes I found that one of the best entry points into a dialogue or conversation with Christians, Christian Zionists, is to share stories on the ground, especially if these stories come from Palestinian Christians. It's not because our suffering is different than that of others, but that can serve as an entry point into a wider discussion about Palestinians and the injustice in general. It is important here to note that not all Christian Zionists are strong, aggressive, militant, and so on. Many Christians support Israel because they think this is the only option, and we should engage them. We should challenge them with an alternative perspective, and we should do it in love. We should do it in a spirit that reflects who we are. This is not about fighting, one way with the other. And when we respond to such idea, we should respond in a way that honors God. I think this is what will draw people if we rely on the spirit and show that loving mentality. And finally, as I mentioned in the end of my presentation, the document Cry for Hope offers very practical steps from ethical tourism, how to do tourism, into how to do theology in seminaries and churches, revisiting that, into the idea of creative resistance and taking a stand. As I said in my presentation, it's not enough to say, well, we heard a different perspective, so now let's pray for peace between Palestinians and Israelis. Yes, it's important to pray for peace, but we don't need diplomatic Christians, we need prophetic Christians. I always say many Christians are obsessed with prophecy, and I wish they were prophetic. And this is what we need: prophetic Christians who challenge injustice. Palestinian Christian organizations, theological movements, activists on the ground can always offer practical steps, as I said, beginning from pilgrimage to conferences to theology to many ways. And I encourage you to always be in conversation with us on this matter.
I think I just want to add to what Munir said,
yes,
that thank you. Sorry, I just started talking without you telling me. Sorry. So I think I've noticed that we only have one idea of eschatology or end times theology that talks about the destruction of the Middle East and Armageddon, and we need to find other ways to talk about end times within our evangelical or our Christian sectors, and I think that's missing. Like there's a big tendency with books and stuff to talk about a dispensationalist idea of eschatology, and I think as Christians we need to rethink that and do the work of what the Bible is really saying about end times. And I think those conversations can be really, really good, and challenging Orientalism, the generalizations about Orientalism is also a very important thing that we must do. Like no one likes to be generalized, and challenging those generalizations, like really are all people in the Middle East militant, Muslims, terrorists, challenge all those rhetoric, and I think that's going to make a lot very enriching conversations with other people.
But this webinar is a global webinar. But those of us who live in countries like India, where Christianity itself is a micro minority and really has little voice and is so divided, you're quite right when you say the mainland churches, Catholic Church in particular, have withdrawn from the grassroots debate on this issue and left it only to small, well-funded and aggressive Zionist groups to dwell. And I think we have lost the capacity to challenge them. It is surprising that even in the Catholic Church, in my parish, if you were to ask today or tell them that they are Christians or Arabs who believe in the same Jesus that you do, they would be surprised and be shocked. And that is it. Educating our own people becomes a primary thing in what is happening. And I think their churches do much more. And I think we also need material in our languages. Translating this to people who got the South India, etc., is a major task. And webinars like this, I think, are, I wish we could have a webinar where we could interpret what you were saying into Tamil or into Hindi, to major language groups, or into Malayalam, which is the stronghold of Christianity and unfortunately also of a new brand of Zionism. That would at least begin the process. But just now, Christian Zionism merges with Islamophobia and the agenda of the government, and you have an impossible situation. Kara, what do you think of this?
Event planners के साथ
Yeah, Sarah or Isaac, whichever.
planners को message हम
Sorry?
Any one of you would like to respond? To countries like India, where we are a minority, and I just explained the situation.
फोन भी कर सकते हैं समझो अभी समझो इवेंट प्लानर्स होती देखो उनको हमें फोन करके डायरेक्टली बोल सकते हैं हम ऐसा है
Noise in the background. Yes,
Talking, please.
it is strange to see the spread of these ideologies everywhere, not just in the United States, Sri Lanka, India, the Philippines, China, Latin America. And oftentimes they are linked with the theology that was imported from the perceived more successful, richer, expansionist churches. And that's why we simply assume if it's a theology that's coming from North America, it must be true. And sadly, exactly as you said, oftentimes when there is sectarian violence or religious violence in these countries, for example, in Africa, in a country like Nigeria or other countries, many Christians simply side with Israel because of their resentment against Islam. And again, that is definitely not a healthy way of engaging with the conflict. This is not about ideologies. This is about God's love for all humans, regardless of their religion and ethnicity. And we can't just take sides based on we side with the Christian or we side with the one with our color and so on. And one final thing, John, I think you're absolutely right in that. Sadly, there are so many Christian leaders who prefer not to engage in this discussion. They don't want to care or to get into something that might bring them a headache, either because, as I said, they want to avoid conflict, or because they just think, we should pray for both sides and do nothing, and this is not our own. And we cannot do this for several reasons, not just because this is the land of the Bible, but because the church is involved in this conflict. The church has already taken sides, and we cannot simply say, we're not doing anything. No, you are. Even by your silence, you're empowering other Christians to impact this conflict negatively. So ecumenical conversations should happen on national levels worldwide on this topic, because everybody is involved. Every Christian is, whether they like it or not, is involved in this conflict. And so many things are taking place in the name of the Bible. And we cannot continue to allow that.
Yeah. Stein from South Africa has asked a question which is almost flowing from what you have just said. And it says, Christian Zionism shares the theological and ideological DNA of South Africa apartheid theology. South African apartheid theology and spirituality was and is a racist theology of creation and creation times, whereas Christian Zionist apartheid theology is a racist and times theology, racist eschatology and spirituality. It flows from what you have just said, and when it takes it further to national issues and merges with them, responding to apartheid, for instance, or to caste in India.
Hi, thank you, Ranjan. Thanks, John. And Aruna, I have to confess, I'm one of those ordinary Christians who sit on the pew, and that too occasionally. So having such presentations, that we've just heard, I wish we could hear those from our pulpits as well, because firstly, we're trying to say, let's try and speak to our own Christian community, and those that come to church regularly are the ones also who end up listening very intently to all the sermons that come from the top. So that's one. How do we do that and to ensure that this is being done? And secondly, when Bible is being interpreted and Bible is being used as a huge reference point in churches by theologians or Christian leaders, why aren't other documents like the International Declaration of Human Rights or the international conventions that were ratified by our countries that relate directly to violations of what Israel's government policies are today? And that never seems to be a reference point, or that doesn't seem to fit into the Bible context. Because for me, love is not just about peace and hope, but love is really justice. Because rather than for us to talk about the end times, we're living in today's times, which is just so full of violence and so much of hatred and so much of inequality. And I'd like to see that we go beyond just just theology, because for me, theology, sometimes it feels as if it's only meant for theologians, but it is really a theology on the ground. And if we don't see Christian activism on the ground, and we have existing platforms on the ground, there are other organizations who work on human rights. There are other secular groups who work on human rights. There are even maybe some ecumenical movements who work on human rights. So when is it going to happen when we actually see this kind of Christian activism from our leaders, as well as those who congregate every Sunday, to say that church is not just about Sundays and listening to these, very inspiring sermons, but it's really about the ground reality outside our very homes. And many of you today said that, being silent is actually taking sides and taking the sides of the wrong. So that's just some of my comments, and also my questions, especially to Muntar and Sarah.
Sarah, would you care to respond?
I think it's a call to engage in these tough conversations and questioning end times. It's really interesting, but we have a more pagan understanding of prophecy than biblical, because we see prophecy as kind of telling us about end times and what's going to happen in the future, when actually biblical prophecy, it's about prophetic callings. It's 95% of what the Bible calls prophecy. It's talking against injustice. It's talking against world powers that are dominating the orphan, the poor, the widow. So I think challenging those kind of things in conversations we have is really important, like to understand what prophecy is challenging those, as you were saying, day-to-day realities that we're living, and not really speculating about what the mystery of what's going to happen next. So I think I'm encouraged by what you're all saying, is that we need to engage in difficult conversations. We don't need to shy away from this subject, and maybe try for other pastors to talk about these issues from the pulpit. And I think it's a call for all of us to engage in this difficult scenario, and if it means being called, against God's plan and being too political, then that's a burden we must carry to showcase the real Christian message that we're trying to portray in the Arab world, that is so necessary. Like, you talk about Christian missions in the Arab world, and they're struggling because there's no good message. If you're just saying, that Armageddon is going to happen in the Middle East and there will be no peace in the Middle East, like, what kind of message are we giving our brothers and sisters in the Middle East?
Yeah. So thank
you so much, Ada.
More than hearing from the pulpit, it's a question of challenging the pulpit in most cases.
Yeah, fair enough. True.
Hello everyone, especially thank you, Dr. Muntar, and
I can't hear you well, Ellen.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, better.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Muntar and Sarah, for the brilliant presentation and for your invitation actually to evaluate our theological commitments, and especially our theological articulation that is detrimental to vulnerable communities. My question, especially as a biblical student, I'm doing my PhD at the Lutheran School of Theology of Chicago, and Dr. Muntar, I met you there. Yes, we worked together when you preached there. I'm working on a project that actually questions the projection of control of land. The control of land, and how there are some communities that can use violence and conquest and grab lands, and which is detrimental to other communities. And when I discussed this project with one of my advisor was like, are you going to project Jews as bad? Because I'm a post-Holocaust feminist. And I'm like, did you really say that? So there's a struggle actually in trying to understand, or, within the academia itself, in how the understanding of post-Holocaust interpretations versus our commitment to the changing vulnerability, right? The changing vulnerability of communities. And so I personally believe that control of land is wrong. And so I personally question that how do you as as somebody who have presented on this topic, understand post-Holocaust interpretations as?
And yeah, I think I remember we met, and these are two loaded questions. Let me quickly comment on land control. I think that a careful analysis of the biblical data will clearly show that the Bible is against land control. But it's always about using the land for the good of the community. And once the land is no longer used in that way, God will take the land from that community. The land distribution in the Bible, the fact that it belonged to families rather than to the monarch, to the king, I think that's huge in our understanding of land control, and that it's not land owned by the state, rather it's land owned by communities. It cannot be sold, but always borrowed, and then it should always return to the owners, and land should always create equal opportunities, should be distributed equally, and so on. So I think we need to have a more clear reading of what it means to, the land inheritance. I wrote about this in my first book. And I think the issue with post-Holocaust theology is an important question that we shouldn't just take lightly, because there was so many triumphalist Christian readings of the Bible that we need to be honest, were not just offensive to the Jewish people, but led directly to their persecution. And so we should clearly do clear self-analysis of our theology about others in general and about the Jewish people in particular, because we have been we have a bad history in that, and it led to catastrophic results. However, I think in one context, it's very important to differentiate between our criticism of the state of Israel with our position as Christians towards the Jewish people. I think that's clearly important, and we should at the same time be careful to engage with the many leading and increasing Jewish voices that are also opposed to Zionism. The response to anti-Semitism, in my opinion, cannot simply be a national movement that brings all the Jews to one place in the world. Rather, our response to anti-Semitism should be respecting the Jewish people as neighbors wherever they are. And so my response to all of this, and again, I keep referring to my books, in my latest book, I simply say the theology we need towards the Jewish people is simply love your neighbor as yourselves. They are our neighbors. We should respect, love, and engage with them as people of faith. And we shouldn't be manipulated to respond to anti-Semitism by supporting an exclusive nationalistic movement. We should say no to that. So yes to loving the Jews as our neighbors. Yes to challenging them when and then allowing them to challenge us. Clearly, we should say no to any notions of superiority, any prejudice emotions we have against the Jewish people. But if post-Holocaust theology means that we should support a nationalistic, exclusive ideology that created an oppressive country, I think we should challenge that, and we should be bold to say no to that.
Sarah would like to add to that. We are coming close to the end, not the end times.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Helen for her question. I think it's really important, and I wanted to highlight the work of Jewish Voice for Peace. And it's an NGO that's working towards the liberation, and they call it like this, the liberation of Palestinians, because by working towards the liberation of the Palestinian people, they're going to work towards the liberation of the Jewish people. And I think that's the kind of conversation that we need to take this subject about. Like what I was trying to say at the end of my conversation, that we acknowledge the pain and the suffering of the Jewish people, but like Gideon Levy was saying, when we remember the Holocaust in today's age, we remember Gaza. We remember the suffering of the Palestinian people as a consequence of the Holocaust, as a consequence of everything that happened and the pain that the Jewish communities went through. So I think Jewish Voice for Peace is an excellent NGO that shows that they are against the occupation. They call about the rights of Palestinian refugees. They talk about Gaza. They have a very interesting project called the Nakba, and is trying to teach Jewish people from America, American Jews and people elsewhere about the Nakba, about the ongoing suffering of the Palestinian people, and they're realizing that there will be no end of their suffering until they put an end to the suffering of the Palestinians. So I think moving towards that conversation of a united front for the good of the Middle East is something that's going to help. And yeah, I encourage you guys to see more about this very interesting organization.
Thank you very much. That gives us an idea. Maybe sometime in the future, a Jew from the JVP and a Palestinian Christian, 2 by 2, could come and speak at every church in India, at least in South Asia. Things will change. We have a last question from Mr. Nehemiah, and after that, Roger will conclude this webinar.
Hello.
Emmanuel Nehemiah.
Yes, yes. Am I clear? Am I audible?
Yes, very clear, very visible.
Okay, okay. I have a comment to make and raise 2 questions. The comment is this: I think we have to consciously undo the very impact of atonement theory and the framework to which theology also succumbs to even think about anything to do with the Israel-Palestinian issue. I very strongly believe in this, because this entire enterprise of Armageddon and the end times and all of it is such a nexus with the atonement theory. This is my comment. The 2 questions that I would want to raise is this. Both the presenters in a way touched upon how nationalism is such a demonic and confusing thing that is threatening the entire humanity. In such a context, to even think about shared land is okay on some level, but then to have some criticality to think secular is very important. See, I am raising this question exclusively from a Indian Dalit perspective. Dalit Christians in the country are somebody to whom the right to religion is been denied constitutionally for 70 years.
I know.
Yes. So for me, even to think secular is difficult. In the words of Ambedkar, secularism is something that he didn't agree upon, basically because you have to compromise with a religion that upholds the value of caste, which is Hinduism. Ambedkar's direct attack on Hinduism. But however, to think beyond religion is something that we have to dare here, while we are secure, from a secular point of view, trying to discuss about land and so on. Shared land for me is still not too very convincing. This is directly to Munter. The second question that I would want to raise is this. All of us know, it is quite strange to see blue-eyed, blonde-haired, white-skinned Jews in the Middle East and the African part of the world who claim to be the Jews. And all of us know how the entire European world pushed their own Jews post-Holocaust into this land. We all of us know. Again, my question is related to the previous one that I raised. Sharing land is problematic, and I think we should think about how the Aboriginals in Canada took stock of justice and did not respond to the government and the church, which initiated peace and reconciliation. They said no to peace and reconciliation, basically because they were the affected community. What do you think as a Palestinian Christian? In a way, both my questions are to you. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeremiah. And there are serious questions, Jeremiah. And I wish Nehemiah. Yeah, close enough. There are serious questions that I wish we have lots of time to just sit over coffee and discuss, but they are more serious than that because they involve, our destinies and our livelihoods. And what I also want to say, Nehemiah, is that Ranjan and others know how dear I hold the Dalit cause, and I've read some articles and books about this, and hope one day to connect the 2 communities in a more profound way, in solidarity with one another, and in discussion. And that's a promise I made. Vincent, I think, is with us. To Vincent, and I will continue to do that. And so you have my, I think we should stand in solidarity with one another, and as we do so, Jeremiah, I think we should challenge one another sometimes and engage in these discussions. Yet at the same time, contexts, I think, differ, and we should never claim that there is one solution that fits all. And even though we can discuss together the situation in Palestine and or in India. I cannot go to India and dictate to you how you should deal with your own struggles, other than to say whenever you champion equality and justice, we are with you, and whenever you work for a political system that gives equal rights to all the citizens, regardless, as I put it. And I was clearly speaking about my context, but I think it can apply to your context. But then the interpretation of it or the application of it might differ. And in my context, what I want to say is that Jews and Palestinians should have the same access to the natural resources. This is not what we have. We should have the same rights, which is not what we have. We should have the same status in front of the authorities, which is not what we have. And when I say sharing the land, what I'm against is dividing it based on the powerful gives the smaller. This is your share and this is my share. I've always thought that dividing lands means not engaging with the other, putting walls and saying we cannot get along, so let us divide, let us separate. As a Christian, I cannot accept that solution. And as a Christian, I always say it this way: the end of the occupation cannot be my end goal. My end goal should always be, and that's my dream, that one day maybe my children will have Israeli friends, Israeli Jewish friends, just as I encourage them now to have Palestinian Muslim friends. And my hope and vision one day is that Israeli children and Palestinian children will together build a society. Now, is it a secular society or a religious one? To me, it should be a society that respects everybody and gives equal rights to everybody, regardless of their religion. And I'm sure that in every context, politicians can come up with a system that respects the equity of all. But at the end of the day, even for someone who openly says we should boycott Israel, or who says we should pressure the world to put sanctions on Israel, my end goal is to live with Israelis and Jews and not to eliminate them. And I think if we forget that, we become the beast ourselves. We become we allow exclusive racist ideologies to become our own, and we should always safeguard against that.
I'm into that. Thank you very much. May I invite, and thank you, sir, also. May I invite Roger to give his concluding remarks and bring this fascinating webinar to its logical end.
Friends, can you hear me?
Loud and clear with a bit of an echo.
We are indeed grateful to both Gunther as well as Sarah for the two brilliant presentations we've had today. The first presentation made us look at our Christian Zionist theology or ideology from the experience of Christians right there in Palestine. And it has challenged us to ask ourselves, what kind of a theology do we hold to? It challenges us with all our exclusivist claims that we make about our faith, and therefore we need a rethink. As was said by Leila, how do we enable churches to look at a different theological perspective? And that applies to all of us, even to people in Palestine. While we emphasize justice and peace, can we talk about the God of all peoples? Can we bring up a theology of the God of all peoples, the God who is engaged in the histories of all peoples, as Amos 9:7 puts it? Can we not talk about the God who makes the sun shine on all people, irrespective of where they are? So the God of all peoples. At the same time, given our ecological challenges, we've got to talk of human responsibility, people together facing the consequences of what colonialism, capitalism, globalization is doing to our world. And therefore, this is another important concern, that rather than fighting against one another as human beings, we've got to address this challenge and therefore share our resources in love and justice. The second presentation talks about eschatology and how we also have got gripped with it, particularly in the corona pandemic context, there are so many WhatsApp messages coming around that the end of the world is happening. And in that context, when you look at what Trump has done and what is happening to Israel as a country, the government as it rules, as if prophecies are being fulfilled, it is in such a context that we have to address this issue of eschatology. It is a challenge for us that we have to make our church people look at eschatology from a different perspective and not from a linear perspective where we are going to finish at an end where God will come and in Christ and rule for 1,000 years, punishing the people, and it just goes off in a different direction. We are talking of the God of creation who is going to bring in a new creation, a new heaven and a new earth. And therefore in that, how do we look at love and justice in this new earth? So these are challenges. Here in India, just like Palestinian Christians, we are beginning to feel the brunt of Hindutva, where we as Christians are not considered to be part of India. We are also to be considered as second class or third class citizens of Hindu India. So there are these challenges for us as well. And so how do we relate in solidarity with our Palestinian Christian friends and with all humanity? As we look at the globe today, there are so many different places where people are being marginalized, oppressed on the basis of race and religion. So thank you once again, Hunter and Sarah, for giving your insightful presentations, making us think afresh from the post-colonial, post-Holocaust perspective, and from the positive perspective of a new heaven, a new earth, an eco-friendly earth where we all live in love and justice. Thank you indeed. Over to you, Ranjan.
Thanks, Roger. I don't think I want to add anything to what you have already said. Thank you all for joining this webinar at this time from different parts of the world. I think this is quite unique in that sense that we are here from North America to Australia, two very different time zones. And these are the two people who made the biggest sacrifices to be with us. Latin America too. It was comfortable for Asians and Africans, and I think we should do better in terms of planning our meetings so that we can actually include them also in our deliberations. But this doesn't end here, as I said at the start. The debate on Christian Zionism will continue, and we have plans to take it with other constituencies, both within nature and within oppressed communities around the world. So we will look to see how we can create a process of uniting the oppressed and fighting the oppressor. Thank you very much again.